It was just another typical day in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The sun shone brightly in the clear blue sky, and the warm breeze made the trees sway gently. On this peaceful afternoon, a young black teenager was on his way home after a quick trip to the convenience store. He had bought a few snacks for himself and was carrying the small bag with a relaxed stride, enjoying the feeling of the cool air against his skin. His thoughts weren't on anything in particular, just the usual, typical thoughts of a teenager. He lived in this neighborhood, went to school nearby, and didn't expect anything out of the ordinary to happen today. But that peace was about to be shattered. As he walked along the sidewalk, a white woman, who was sitting on her front porch nearby, looked out and saw him. She didn't know who he was or where he was going, but something about the sight of a black teen walking alone in the neighborhood made her uneasy. She felt a wave of discomfort and suspicion rise in her chest. Maybe it was his unfamiliarity in her area, or maybe it was just her own biases coming to the surface. Whatever the reason, she made a snap judgment. Without thinking it through, without stopping to ask him if he needed help or even speaking to him at all, she reached for her phone. Her fingers trembled slightly as she dialed 911. She gave a description of the teen, saying he seemed out of place, and mentioned that he was walking down the street looking suspicious. The dispatcher on the other end of the line asked questions, trying to understand the situation better. But the woman, still feeling uneasy and unable to explain her exact concern, only repeated that the teen looked strange. She insisted that someone needed to come by and check on him. To her, it was better to be safe than sorry. But what she didn't realize was that her call was based on assumptions and a growing, misplaced fear. The teen, meanwhile, continued walking with no awareness of what was about to unfold. He was just a regular kid, going home like any other day. The sound of his footsteps echoed on the pavement, and the quiet hum of the neighborhood seemed to make everything feel calm and ordinary. He didn't notice the woman staring at him from her porch or the fact that she had made the decision to call the police. As he passed a few more houses, he heard the distant sound of a siren approaching. At first, he thought it was just a car or something unrelated, but as the sound grew louder and louder, it became clear that it was the unmistakable wail of a police siren. Confused, he turned his head just in time to see a police car pull up and stop nearby. A police officer stepped out and started walking toward him. The teen's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea what was going on. He had never been in trouble before, never even spoken to a police officer in this way. The officer walked up to him with a serious look on his face and asked, "What are you doing here?" The teenager was taken aback, but remained calm. He had done nothing wrong, so he simply explained that he was just walking home. He held up his bag of snacks to show the officer that he wasn't carrying anything suspicious, that he wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary. Yet, despite the teen's calm demeanor, the officer didn't seem convinced. He stood there, waiting for more answers. The teen's heart was now racing a bit, not because he was doing something wrong, but because he couldn't understand why he was being questioned in the first place. It was then that he noticed the woman still standing on her porch, watching from a distance. She didn't seem to look at him with the same curiosity as before, but instead, she watched the scene unfold with a hint of guilt in her eyes. Realizing her call was the reason the officer was there, the woman stood on her porch, nervously watching the scene unfold. The police car was parked in front of her house, and the officer had already approached the teenager. Her heart was racing now, as she watched him explain himself calmly to the officer. She had never expected things to go this far. When she made that 911 call, she didn't think much of it. She had simply seen someone she didn't recognize in the neighborhood and felt uneasy. Now, as the situation began to unfold, she realized that her actions were causing more trouble than she had anticipated. The dispatcher on the other end of the line had asked her some basic questions, and she answered them as best as she could. She didn't know exactly why the teen looked suspicious to her. Maybe it was the fact that he was walking alone, or maybe it was just her fear of the unknown. But she had told the dispatcher that the teen seemed out of place, even though she didn't know him or have any reason to believe he was doing anything wrong. The woman had no idea how her call would affect him, and now she was starting to feel guilty. The officer was standing near the teenager, his hands on his hips, as if waiting for something. The teen had his hands visible, showing that he wasn't holding anything dangerous, but the officer still looked wary. It wasn't like the officer was acting in a hostile manner. He was just doing his job. But there was an uncomfortable tension in the air. The officer kept glancing at the woman on the porch, perhaps trying to get a clearer idea of what was going on. She couldn't help but feel like she had just made a huge mistake. The teen was still calm, but the longer the conversation went on, the more uneasy he started to feel. He had never been in a situation like this before. He wasn't used to being treated like he had done something wrong, and he could feel the eyes of the officer on him. There was a knot forming in his stomach. He had just been walking home from the store, and now here he was, stuck in this confusing situation because of someone else's assumption. As the minutes ticked by, the tension between the officer and the teenager seemed to grow. Neither of them was saying much. The officer had asked the teen a few more questions about where he was coming from and why he was in the neighborhood, and the teen had answered them truthfully. Still, there was a strange, uncomfortable silence in the air. The officer didn't seem convinced, but he didn't appear to be ready to take any action, either. It was then that the woman on the porch started to feel a little more nervous. She hadn't expected things to get this far, and now she was wondering if she had made a huge mistake by calling the police in the first place. She could see that the teenager wasn't doing anything wrong, but it was too late to take back her call. She could only watch as the officer and the teen exchanged words. Just as the woman was starting to feel the weight of her decision, she heard the sound of an approaching car. A black SUV pulled up to the curb behind the police car. The officer turned his head as the car stopped, and the woman looked on, wondering who it was. The door of the SUV opened, and out stepped a man who immediately caught everyone's attention. His presence was strong and commanding, and as he walked toward the scene, it was clear he wasn't an ordinary person. The officer and the woman both stood a little straighter, sensing that something had just shifted. The man walked with purpose, his every step measured and confident. The woman felt a sudden wave of embarrassment rush over her. Who was this man, and why did he seem so familiar? The officer, who had been questioning the teenager just moments ago, now looked uncertain. The man's confident stride and authoritative posture made it clear that he was someone important, someone who was not easily ignored. And little did the woman know, this man's arrival was about to change everything. As the man approached, the tension in the air seemed to shift. The officer, who had been standing next to the teenager just moments before, straightened up as the man drew closer. His demeanor immediately changed, and it was clear that he recognized the new arrival. The woman on the porch, still nervous and unsure about what was happening, couldn't help but wonder who this man was. He had an air of authority about him that seemed impossible to ignore. He wasn't wearing a uniform, but there was something about the way he carried himself that made it obvious he was someone of importance. The man walked with purpose, his steps firm and steady. He approached the officer and nodded in greeting, a look of calm assurance on his face. The officer, who had seemed somewhat uncertain before, now appeared to stand a little taller. It was almost as if the arrival of this man had suddenly changed the whole dynamic of the situation. "Is there a problem here?" the man asked, his voice deep and clear, cutting through the quiet. The officer hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing his words. It wasn't every day that someone with such a commanding presence showed up in the middle of a routine situation. The woman, still on her porch, watched with growing curiosity. She had no idea who this man was, but she could tell that his presence was making the officer reconsider his actions. The officer looked at the teenager, then at the man, before finally answering in a respectful tone. "There was a call about this young man," the officer said, his voice a little more measured than before. "A woman said he was acting suspicious." The man nodded slowly, understanding the situation. He looked at the teenager, who stood there with his hands still visible, trying to remain calm despite the confusion. The young man's expression showed no signs of fear, just quiet patience. The man's gaze softened as he turned to the officer. "Is there any reason to believe this young man has done anything wrong?" the man asked. The officer paused for a moment, glancing at the woman on the porch, who was now watching the exchange with a mixture of uncertainty and guilt. The officer seemed to hesitate, as if he was unsure whether to continue questioning the teenager or simply let the situation go. The teenager, sensing that things were beginning to change, took a deep breath and spoke up. "I'm just walking home," he said quietly. "I wasn't doing anything wrong. I don't know why the call was made." The man, hearing the teenager's calm response, gave a small nod. He turned back to the officer, his gaze steady and unwavering. "It seems there's been a misunderstanding," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "I'm sure this young man didn't mean any harm. He's simply going home." The officer, still looking a little uncertain, looked at the teenager one last time. The situation had taken a turn, and it was clear that the officer was beginning to understand that perhaps the call had been made without reason. With a final glance at the man, the officer nodded. "All right, I'll let you go this time," he said, his tone softer than before. The woman on the porch, who had been silently watching everything unfold, felt a wave of embarrassment wash over her. She hadn't expected this man to show up, and now she realized how out of place her actions had been. She had called the police without fully understanding the situation, and now, standing on her porch, she realized how quickly things could escalate based on assumptions alone. The man turned back to the teenager, who was still standing there, calm and composed despite the awkwardness of the situation. He gave the young man a reassuring look, then turned his attention to the woman on the porch. The woman quickly averted her gaze, feeling the weight of her mistake. She didn't know what to say, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just learned a valuable lesson about judgment and assumptions. As the officer got back into his car, ready to leave, the man turned to the teenager and gave him a small, knowing smile. "You did well," he said, his voice steady and calm. "Sometimes people make quick judgments, but you handled it with grace." The teenager nodded, grateful for his father's words. The confusion of the moment had started to fade, and as they walked back toward their home, the young man felt a sense of relief, knowing that he had remained calm and that everything had been resolved. As the officer drove away, the scene started to calm. The quiet afternoon air returned, but it was clear that the mood had shifted. The woman on the porch, who had been watching the entire interaction, was still standing there, trying to process everything that had just happened. She hadn't expected the arrival of the man in the black SUV, and she certainly hadn't expected the quiet authority he carried with him. The teenager, still standing calmly, now looked to the man with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. Who was this person? Why did everyone seem to listen to him so intently? The man, seeing his son's questioning glance, smiled warmly. There was no tension or anger in his face, just a quiet, steady confidence that seemed to put everyone at ease. He turned to the teen and gave him a small nod, silently reassuring him that everything was going to be fine. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder and walked with him toward the house, both of them taking slow, deliberate steps. The teenager's mind was still racing. He had been walking home from the store like he did every day, never imagining that something so unexpected could happen. When the police car had arrived, he had felt a surge of confusion and worry. He hadn't done anything wrong, but the situation had still made him uneasy. Now, seeing his father's calm presence, he felt a sense of relief, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As they reached their front door, the man turned to his son and spoke gently. "You did the right thing," he said, his voice steady. "You stayed calm, even when it didn't make sense." The teenager nodded, though he still felt uneasy. "I don't understand why she called the police," he said quietly. "I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was just walking home." His father sighed. understanding his frustration. Sometimes people act out of fear or misunderstanding, he explained. When they don't know someone, or they're not used to seeing certain things, they might feel threatened, even if there's no reason to be. It's not about you. It's about how they see the world. The teenager thought about his father's words. It wasn't the first time he had heard such explanations, but today it felt different. The entire situation felt different. The woman's call to the police had been based on her own assumptions, not on any real threat or danger. And yet, it had almost escalated into something far worse. "I just don't get it," the teenager said. "Why do people do that? Why judge someone based on what they look like, or where they come from?" His father paused for a moment, considering how best to explain. People are often influenced by their surroundings, by what they're taught or told, but it doesn't make it right. The key is to rise above it. Don't let fear or misunderstanding define who you are. The teenager nodded slowly, trying to wrap his head around it. He still didn't fully understand, but he could see where his father was coming from. He knew that his father had seen and experienced much more in his life than he ever would, and the calm way in which he handled the situation made the teenager realize something important. Strength didn't come from power or anger. It came from knowing how to remain calm and respectful, no matter the circumstances. As they stood at the door, the father gave his son one last piece of advice. Never let someone else's fear or ignorance make you feel less than who you are. You have control over your actions, and that's what truly matters. The teenager looked up at his father, feeling a sense of pride. The man smiled, his eyes full of understanding. "Come on," he said. "Let's get inside. We'll talk more later, but for now, let's just take a moment to relax." The two of them walked into the house, the door closing behind them with a soft click. The teenager felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The tension from earlier was fading, but the lessons of the day were still fresh in his mind. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but with his father's wisdom, he felt more prepared to face whatever came his way. Inside their home, the teenager and his father settled into the living room, the weight of the earlier events still lingering in the air. The house was quiet, the hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the clock, the only sounds that filled the space. The teenager sat down on the couch, still trying to process everything that had just happened. His father sat beside him, the calmness of his presence a sharp contrast to the tension that had just unfolded outside. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The teen's thoughts were racing. He kept replaying the scene in his mind, trying to figure out where things had gone wrong. He couldn't understand why the woman had called the police in the first place. He had done nothing wrong. And yet, in a matter of moments, he found himself in a situation where he had to explain himself to the authorities. "I just don't get it, Dad," the teenager said, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet, still filled with confusion. "Why would she call the cops on me? I wasn't doing anything suspicious. I was just walking home like I always do." His father, who had been deep in thought, turned to him and gave a soft smile, his eyes full of understanding. "I know it doesn't make sense, son. Sometimes people act out of fear or because they don't know any better. They judge based on things they don't fully understand, and that's what happened today." He paused, choosing his words carefully. People see things in different ways, and when they don't know you, they can make assumptions. It's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong, but it happens. The teenager nodded slowly, still trying to absorb what his father was saying. It wasn't the first time he'd been told that people sometimes judged others unfairly, but today it felt different. Today, he had been the one to experience that unfair judgment. "So, what do I do about it?" he asked. "I can't just let it go. It feels wrong." His voice was tinged with frustration now. He wasn't used to feeling like this, confused, angry, and helpless all at once. His father leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful as he considered the question. "You can't control what other people think, son, but you can control how you respond. You don't let their fear or their assumptions define you. You rise above it. The most important thing is that you stay true to who you are. The teenager listened carefully, still processing his father's words. It felt like the right advice, but it was hard to know exactly how to act on it. How could he rise above something that felt so personal? How could he stay calm and composed when something like this happened? You handled it well today, his father added, noticing the doubt in his son's expression. You didn't let the situation rattle you. You stayed calm when most people would have been upset or defensive. That's strength. Real strength comes from being able to stay grounded in moments like this. The teenager's frustration eased a little, replaced by a quiet sense of pride. His father's words meant a lot to him. He had always looked up to him, admired the calm and confident way he carried himself, and now he was beginning to understand why his father was the way he was. It wasn't because he was always right, but because he knew how to handle difficult situations with grace and dignity. I don't want this to happen again, the teen said, his voice softer now. But I guess I don't really have control over that, do I? His father smiled, shaking his head gently. No, you don't always have control over what other people do. But you do have control over how you react. You can't stop people from making assumptions, but you can always choose how to respond when it happens. And when you respond with calm, with dignity, you show that you're not affected by fear or misunderstanding. The teenager leaned back on the couch, his thoughts swirling. He realized his father was right. He couldn't change the way others saw him, but he could change the way he saw himself. And as long as he stayed true to who he was, no matter what others thought, he would be okay. The house was still, the quiet sense of peace beginning to settle in again. But the teenager knew that the lessons of the day would stick with him for a long time. It was a moment that had opened his eyes to something deeper, something important. He wasn't sure what the future would hold, but he felt stronger knowing that, no matter what, he would face it with the strength and calm that his father had shown him. The days following the incident were quieter, but the teenager couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Every time he walked down the street, he felt a little more cautious, his mind replaying the scene with the police. He didn't want to feel scared, but the situation had shaken him. It wasn't just about what had happened that day. It was about how quickly things had escalated. One simple call that turned into a moment of tension, confusion, and fear. And for what? Because of an assumption. It wasn't long before he began to notice little things. Sometimes, when he was walking down the street, he would catch someone's gaze for a second too long, or hear a car slow down as it passed by. He wasn't sure if it was in his head, but it seemed like people were more watchful, more suspicious. Maybe it was just the aftermath of the incident, or maybe people were just noticing him more now. Either way, it made him feel uneasy. His father had noticed the change in his son too. At dinner one night, the man saw how his son kept glancing around as if checking over his shoulder, the way he hesitated before answering questions, or how he sometimes sat a little too still, as if waiting for something to happen. The man wasn't blind to the fact that his son had been affected by what had occurred, but he also knew that he needed to address it in a way that would help his son move forward, not dwell on the fear. After dinner, they both walked out to the porch, the cool evening air providing a peaceful contrast to the tension that had been building in the teenager. His father leaned against the railing, looking out at the neighborhood while his son sat next to him. "Something on your mind, son?" his father asked gently, his voice calm but direct. The teenager sighed, looking out into the quiet street. "I keep thinking about that day. I don't get it. Why did she do that? I mean, I was doing nothing wrong, and yet, there I was, standing in front of a police officer." His father nodded, acknowledging his son's frustration. "I understand. It's hard when things don't make sense, but you can't let what happened change who you are or how you walk through the world." "I don't know," the teenager replied quietly. "It's just that now. Every time I walk down the street, I wonder if people are looking at me the way she did. I feel like I'm being watched, like I'm doing something wrong even though I'm not. His father looked at him for a moment, seeing the uncertainty in his eyes. Fear has a funny way of making people see things that aren't there. The truth is, you can't control how others view you, but you can control how you let it affect you. The teenager frowned, not fully understanding. But how do I not let it affect me? It feels like everything's different now. Like I can't just walk down the street without wondering if someone's going to judge me. His father smiled softly, knowing that his son was still processing everything. The world doesn't always make sense, son. And people's actions, whether good or bad, don't always reflect who you are. But what you can control is how you react to them. You don't have to carry their judgments with you. You can choose to walk in your own truth, no matter what others might think. The teenager sat in silence, thinking about his father's words. The advice wasn't new, but it felt different now. He was starting to understand that people's judgments were based on their own perceptions, not facts. It wasn't always about him. He wasn't the one with the problem. Other people were the ones making assumptions, and he didn't have to carry that weight. But how do I stop feeling like I'm being washed? The teenager asked, looking over at his father with a mix of hope and doubt. His father looked at him with understanding. It's about confidence, son. It's about knowing that no matter how others see you, you know who you are. You walk with purpose. You don't let fear make decisions for you. The teenager thought about this for a moment. He had always tried to be confident, but now it felt like it was going to be harder. But then he remembered how his father had handled the situation with the police, how he had kept his cool, how he had been strong even when things were uncertain. That was the kind of strength he wanted to carry with him. I'll try, the teenager said quietly, feeling a sense of resolve building inside him. I'll try to remember that. His father smiled, a proud expression crossing his face. That's all anyone can ask for, son. Just take it one step at a time. You'll get there. As they sat together on the porch, the teenager began to feel the weight of his earlier fears lifting, just a little bit. It wasn't going to be easy, but he now understood that he didn't have to let other people's assumptions define him. He could choose how to walk through the world, with confidence and pride. The following week, life started to return to a sense of normalcy for the teenager. He was back to his usual routine, walking home from school, meeting friends, and doing his homework. But there was still a quiet thought in the back of his mind that lingered, an unshakable awareness that things weren't always as simple as they seemed. Even though the incident with the police had been resolved, the shadow of that day still followed him. One afternoon, as he was walking home, he saw a group of kids playing basketball on the street corner. They were laughing and joking, the sound of the ball bouncing against the pavement echoing through the neighborhood. It felt like a normal, carefree scene. But as he walked closer, one of the kids, who had never really spoken to him before, gave him a long look. The teenager hesitated, unsure if it was just his mind playing tricks on him. Was this just another person who might look at him differently? He kept walking, trying not to overthink it, but a small voice inside his head asked, "What if they judge me the way she did?" He shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought. "Don't let it get to you," he told himself. "Don't let fear take over." But it was easier said than done. Later that evening, when he was sitting at the dinner table with his family, he found himself lost in thought again. His mind was still grappling with the situation. He could feel the weight of it, like a cloud that followed him everywhere. It wasn't just about what had happened that day. It was about what could happen next. He wasn't sure if the world had changed, or if he was just seeing it differently now. His father, noticing that his son seemed distracted, gave him a gentle smile. "You've got something on your mind, son," he said, his voice filled with understanding. The teenager looked up, startled out of his thoughts. "I'm fine," he replied quickly, but his father wasn't fooled. He could see the uncertainty in his son's eyes, the same uncertainty he had seen in him after the incident with the police. "Come on, talk to me," his father encouraged. "You're not the only one who's been through tough times. We all have our struggles." The teenager sighed and put down his fork, finally deciding to speak. It's just, I don't know. I feel like I'm walking around with a target on my back sometimes, like people are going to see me and think the worst. It's not like I can forget what happened, you know. His father nodded, his expression thoughtful. I understand. It's not easy to just shake something like that off. But what you have to remember is that it's not about what others think of you. It's about what you know to be true. You have nothing to prove to anyone. But it feels like I do, the teenager admitted. Like I have to constantly prove I'm not who people might think I am. That's a heavy burden to carry, his father agreed. But the truth is, you don't have to prove anything. All you can do is be yourself. Keep doing what you know is right, and the rest will follow. You can't control how people think, but you can control how you live. The teenager sat quietly, absorbing his father's words. It was hard to let go of the feeling that he had to somehow convince the world that he wasn't a threat. But his father's calm advice reminded him that his value didn't come from the opinions of others. His value came from who he was, not from anyone's judgment. Thanks, Dad, the teenager said, feeling a little lighter. I needed to hear that. His father smiled warmly, his hand resting on his son's shoulder. Anytime, son. You don't have to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. You're not alone in this. The conversation brought some peace to the teenager. He still didn't have all the answers, but he was beginning to understand that the journey wasn't about proving something to the world. It was about accepting himself for who he was and not letting others' fears or assumptions shape his future. The next day, as he walked home from school again, he felt a little different. The thoughts that had once plagued him, of being judged or looked at with suspicion, didn't seem as heavy. He knew that it wasn't going to be easy, but with each step, he was learning to let go of the fear. His father's words echoed in his mind. You don't have to prove anything. Just be yourself. As he passed by the same group of kids playing basketball, he looked over, and this time, instead of feeling nervous or self-conscious, he smiled. The kids waved at him, their laughter still filling the air, and he realized something important. I don't need to be afraid anymore. For the first time in a while, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. Things weren't perfect, and there would still be moments of doubt, but as long as he stayed true to himself, he knew he could face whatever came his way. As the weeks passed, the teenager began to embrace the lessons his father had taught him. Every day, he worked a little harder to shake off the weight of the fears that had once consumed him. He still had moments when he felt uncertain, especially when walking through the neighborhood or when he caught someone's eyes for a little too long. But each time, he remembered what his father had said about rising above judgment and staying true to who he was. One afternoon, he was sitting in the park, reading a book. It had become one of his favorite places to unwind. The park was peaceful, with only the sound of children playing and birds chirping in the distance. He had just turned a page when he noticed a familiar face walking toward him, a classmate he didn't know very well, but someone he'd seen around school. The classmate had been in the same group during a class project a few weeks ago. The teenager felt a knot form in his stomach. Would this be another situation where he was judged based on assumptions? Would this person see him differently, like the woman had that day? But as the classmate drew closer, they made eye contact, and to his surprise, the classmate smiled warmly. Hey, you're that guy from Mr. Harris' class, right? The classmate said. I didn't get a chance to talk to you much during the project, but I've seen you around. How's it going? The teenager blinked, taken aback. It was such a simple thing, a friendly greeting, but in that moment, it felt like a huge shift. There was no judgment in the other person's eyes, no suspicion or discomfort, just a genuine, kind expression. The teenager smiled back, relieved, and responded, Yeah, that's me. Things are going well, just taking it easy. How about you? The two of them ended up talking for a while, chatting about school, sports, and even their shared interest in video games. It was a simple, normal conversation, but it meant a lot to the teenager. For the first time in a while, he didn't feel like he had to prove anything to anyone. He could just be himself, without fear or worry. As the conversation came to an end, the classmate gave him a friendly wave. "It was nice talking to you. See you around." "Yeah, see you," the teenager called back, smiling to himself. Later that day, he sat with his father on the porch, reflecting on the encounter. He realized that, while there were always going to be challenges in life, those challenges didn't have to define him. He didn't have to live in fear of what other people might think. His father sat next to him, a knowing look on his face. "How was your day?" The teenager smiled, his eyes bright. "It was good. I had a great conversation with a classmate at the park. He was really nice, and it felt like nothing had changed, like I wasn't being judged or anything." His father nodded, a proud smile on his face. "See, you don't have to prove anything to anyone. You just have to be yourself. And sometimes, when you least expect it, people will see you for who you truly are." The teenager felt a sense of peace settle over him. He still wasn't perfect, and there would likely be moments where he felt uncertain or worried again. But in that moment, he understood something important. The fear of being judged, of being misunderstood, could only hold power over him if he allowed it to. And he wasn't going to let it control him any longer. As the days turned into weeks, the teenager's confidence continued to grow. He no longer let the fear of judgment dictate his actions. He walked through the world with a new sense of purpose, a quiet strength that came from knowing who he was. And whenever he felt unsure, he would think back to his father's words. "You don't have to prove anything. Just be yourself." In the end, the teenager realized that while he couldn't change how others saw him, he could always choose how he saw himself. And with that knowledge, he felt ready to face whatever the future held.